The scout ship Halan's Reach was not built for war. It was built to look, to listen, and to run. That was why Captain Ori Fenn liked it. In 22 years of service in the Vantar Coalition Survey Corps, he had never once needed to fire a weapon, and he intended to keep that record clean until he retired. So when the sensor officer, a young Threll named HFY, made a small sound in her throat that meant something is wrong, Fenn felt his gut tighten before she even spoke. "Captain," she said, "I have a mass reading at the edge of the Kelvorn Drift. It is big. Define big. Bigger than anything in our registry. Bigger than a coalition capital ship. Bigger, I think, than anything we have ever logged in this sector." Fenn walked to her station and looked at the screen himself. The Kelvorn Drift was a graveyard of dead stars and drifting rock, far past the edge of coalition space, in a region nobody claimed because nobody wanted it. Ships did not go there. Nothing lived there. That was exactly why the Survey Corps sent scouts through it once every few years, just to make sure it was still empty. It was not empty anymore. "Bring us closer," Fenn said, slowly. "Passive sensors only. I don't want whatever that is to know we're here." The Halan's Reach crept forward for 6 hours before the shape on the screen resolved into something they could actually look at. When it did, nobody on the bridge spoke for a long moment. It was a ship, that much was clear. But it was wrong in every way a ship should not be wrong. It was long, longer than any vessel the Coalition had ever built, easily 10 times the length of a Vantar dreadnought. Its hull was scarred black in some places, and burned silver in others, as if it had been through a fire that should have ended it. Half of one side was torn open, ribs of metal bent outward like a wound that never closed. And yet, despite all of that, it was not dead. Small lights blinked along its length, faint and slow, like the pulse of something asleep rather than something gone. "That is not Coalition design," Waro said quietly. "It is not Threll, not Korathi, not Senevan. I don't know what it is. Run it against every registry we have. Old wars, extinct empires, everything." It took 20 minutes. When the answer came back, it came back with only one word attached, an old flag designation, buried deep in the Coalition's oldest archives, a species classification nobody currently serving had ever seen used. Human. Fenn had heard the word before, the way anyone hears old ghost stories. Humans were a footnote in Coalition history, a species that other, older records mentioned only in passing, always with the same tone, caution, and something that was not quite fear but sat close to it. They had vanished from known space generations ago. Some records said they had died out. Others said they had simply gone quiet. And quiet, in old Coalition military doctrine, was worse than gone. "Send it up the chain," Fenn said. "All of it. Sensor logs, hull imaging, everything. And get us back to a safe distance. We are not equipped for this." 3 jumps away, in the orbital command hub above the Coalition capital world of Ansuvar, Director Yeshel Kaur read the report twice before she called anyone into her office. Kaur was Vantar herself, tall and narrow-shouldered, with the dark feathered ridge along her skull that marked her as coming from the northern hive cities. She had spent 30 years in Coalition intelligence, and in that time she had learned one very important lesson. The things that frightened old records the most were rarely the things that turned out to be nothing. She pulled every file the Coalition had on the word human. There were not many. A handful of second-hand accounts from species who claimed to have traded with them centuries ago. A single damaged data crystal recovered from an ancient battle site, too corrupted to read fully, but containing enough fragments to confirm that humans had fought a war, a long one, against something the old records only called the Skarn, a name that made even the oldest Coalition historians uneasy, because nobody currently alive had ever seen a Skarn, and nobody wanted to. The last confirmed human contact was recorded 400 years ago. After that, nothing. No ships, no signals, no survivors. The species had simply stopped appearing in the galaxy, the way a fire stops appearing once it has burned through everything it was given to burn. And now, drifting silent and half-dead at the edge of the Kelvorn Drift, there was a ship. Kaur called a meeting. The room was small, secure, 3 floors below the surface of Ansuvar's capital tower. Around the table sat 6 people. Kaur herself, General Path Oven, head of Coalition Defense, Dr. Ansel Vey, a soft-spoken Karathi xenoarchaeologist with a reputation for being right more often than anyone liked to admit, 2 junior analysts, and, joining by encrypted feed from a research vessel 3 systems away, Dr. Mireth Sol, a Cenovan biologist who specialized in the study of extinct and near-extinct species. Kaur put the images on the main screen. The room went quiet the same way the Halan's Reach Bridge had gone quiet. "That," General Oven said eventually, "is the largest single vessel I have ever seen. Do we have a weapons assessment?" "Negative," Kaur said. "It is not powered for combat. Life support signatures are minimal. 1, possibly 2, active systems out of what looks like a crew capacity in the low thousands. Everything else reads as dormant or destroyed." "So it's a wreck." "It is a wreck that is still generating a very faint but very stable power signature from somewhere near its core," Dr. Vey said, leaning forward. "Wrecks do not do that. Wrecks run out of power. Something on that ship has been keeping at least part of it alive, for what our best estimate puts at 300 to 400 years. Dr. Sol's voice came through the feed, calm and precise. "If that timeline is correct, it lines up almost exactly with the last confirmed human contact in our records. This may be one of the last human vessels ever seen by anyone, possibly the last." Nobody spoke for a moment. "I want to be very clear about what I am about to ask for," Kaur said, "because I know how it will sound. I am requesting full clearance to send a research and recovery team to that ship. Not a military strike force, a science team, small, careful, with a security escort for protection only. Our records on the human species are thin, fragmented, and 4 centuries out of date. That ship is the single greatest opportunity the Coalition has ever had to actually understand them, rather than guess." General Oven frowned. "Understand them for what purpose?" "Because if that species could fight something called the Skarn, a name our own historians won't say twice in the same conversation, for as long as the old records suggest, and lose so completely that they vanished from the galaxy entirely, then 2 things are true. 1, whatever they were fighting might still be out there, and we know almost nothing about it. 2, whatever they were, to hold on as long as they apparently did, is worth understanding too. Either of those facts alone would justify this. Together, they demand it." Oven was quiet for a long moment, drumming his fingers against the table. "What kind of team?" "Small. A dozen, no more. Xenoarchaeology, xenobiology, structural engineering, a linguist, and a security detachment of 6, led by someone experienced. Nothing that looks like an invasion. Everything that looks like careful, respectful study. And if there is something alive on that ship, something more than a power signature?" Kaur met his eyes. "Then we proceed even more carefully than we already planned to. But General, if there is a chance, even a small one, that a member of a species this old, this capable, and this thoroughly wiped from the galaxy is still alive over there, I do not think we can afford to look away and pretend we did not see it." Oven looked at the image on the screen again, at the long dark shape drifting silent among the dead stars, its few remaining lights blinking on and off like something breathing in its sleep. "Clearance granted," he said finally. "Put your team together, Director, and Kaur, tell them to be careful. I don't like how quiet that thing is." The team came together over the following 2 weeks, pulled from research stations and universities across Coalition space, each of them chosen for a reason. Dr. Ansel Vey would lead the science half of the mission, his decades of experience with dead civilizations making him the obvious choice, though even he admitted privately to Kaur that nothing in his career had prepared him for something quite this large. Dr. Mireth Sol came aboard as lead biologist, her calm voice and steady hands earning her the trust of everyone she worked with. She brought with her a small team of 2 junior researchers, a Threll named Pel Doss and a young Karathi named Ilna Cray, both eager and both slightly too excited for Vey's taste, though he said nothing, remembering his own first expedition at their age. The linguist was a quiet, careful Cenovan named Toma Rule, who had spent the last 6 years of his career trying to reconstruct fragments of old human language from the handful of recovered records the Coalition possessed. He did not sleep well the night before departure. He would later say it was excitement. Nobody who knew him believed that. Security fell to Commander Sael Draith, a broad-shouldered Vontar with a service record that included 2 border conflicts and a reputation for never once losing a member of his team. He brought 5 of his own people, hand-picked, all veterans, all calm under pressure. Draith did not like the assignment. He said so plainly to Kor the day before launch. "I don't like going in blind," he told her. "I don't care how big the reward is. A dead ship that's still generating power after 400 years is not dead. It's asleep. And I have never once in my career liked walking into a room with something asleep in it that I don't understand." "Your concerns are noted, Commander," Kor said, "and they are exactly why you were chosen to lead the escort. I trust your caution more than I trust anyone else's confidence." Draith did not look reassured, but he boarded the transport anyway, because that was the job. Before the ship left, Kor called one more meeting, smaller than the first, just herself, Vey, Sol, Rule, and Draith, sitting around a table with cups of untouched tea going cold in front of them. "I want to say something plainly," Kor told them, "because once you leave, I will not be able to say it to your faces again for a while. This mission matters more than most people in this building understand. The coalition was built by species who agreed, long ago, that no one civilization should ever again face annihilation alone. We built alliances so that would never happen to any of us. But the human records suggest a species that faced something terrible, and faced it mostly by themselves, for longer than any war in our own histories." And then they went silent. If we can learn anything from what happened to them, anything that might help us if the same threat is still out there, this mission is worth the risk. I would not send you if I did not believe that. Vey nodded slowly. "We understand, Director. I don't think you fully do, and I don't think anyone can until they're standing in front of it," Kor said. "But I trust you to be careful anyway. Commander Draith, your job is not glory. Your job is to bring these people home. If anything on that ship makes you uneasy, in your gut, before you can even explain why, I want you to trust that feeling over any order I give you from here. Understood?" Draith allowed himself a small, humorless smile. "Understood, Director. Wish it made me feel better." "It shouldn't," Kor said. "That is rather the point." She walked them out to the landing bay herself, past the loading crews, securing the last of the equipment crates, past the young technicians running final checks on the Ansarvar's Hope's hull. At the base of the boarding ramp, she stopped. "One more thing," she said. "If you find them, if there is truly a human still alive over there, after 400 years, do not treat them like a specimen. Whatever the reports call this mission, whatever the clearance papers say about study and recovery, remember that you may be standing in front of the last survivor of an entire people. Treat them the way you would want to be treated, if your own species had been the one erased." Nobody had an answer for that. They boarded the ship in silence, and the silence stayed with several of them for the whole of the journey. The mission ship, the Ansarvar's Hope, departed Coalition space 11 days later, carrying the 12 members of the research team, a skeleton crew, and enough equipment to survey a ship the size of a small city. Kor saw them off personally, standing on the launch platform as the transport's engines built toward full burn. "Report every day," she told Vey, through the final comlink before the ship entered the long jump toward the Kelvorn Drift. "Anything unusual, anything at all, and I want to know immediately." "Understood, Director," Vey said. "We'll be careful." "I know you will," Kor said. "That's not what worries me." Vey almost asked what she meant by that, but the link closed, and the Ansarvar's Hope began its jump, and there was no more time for questions. The journey took 9 days. The team spent most of it in preparation, running simulations, reviewing every scrap of old data the Coalition had on human technology and human biology, which amounted to frustratingly little. Rule worked through what fragments of language data existed, muttering sounds under his breath that none of the others could quite follow. Sol ran diagnostic checks on medical scanning equipment calibrated for unfamiliar biology, adjusting settings again and again, never quite satisfied. Draith ran his people through boarding drills twice a day, insisting on it even after his second-in-command, a sharp young woman named Corin Vass, pointed out that they had run the same drill 14 times already. "We'll run it 15, Draith said, "and then we'll run it again after that." On the 4th night of the journey, unable to sleep, Rule found Vey alone in the ship's small observation lounge, staring out at the streaked light of the jump corridor. "You are thinking about what we might find," Rule said, sitting across from him. I'm thinking about how little we actually know, Vey admitted. In 30 years of digging through dead civilizations, I have never once approached a site with this little solid information. We have fragments, rumors dressed up as records, a single damaged data crystal that half our translation teams can't agree on. Everything else is guesswork. My work is the same, Rule said. I have spent 6 years trying to reconstruct a language from perhaps 400 recovered words, most of them badly corrupted, and I am still not certain I have the grammar right. If we find human writing on that ship, if we find human speech, I may be more useful to this mission than anyone, or I may be completely wrong about everything I have built, and we will be starting from nothing. Which do you think it will be? Rule considered the question seriously before answering. I think, he said slowly, that a species capable of holding off whatever the Skarn were, for as long as our records suggest, for long enough that they wrote down that they were still fighting when every other trace of them stopped appearing. I think a species like that does not build a simple language. I think we will find something dense, something built by people who had a great deal to say to each other, and not always much time to say it in. Vey did not have an answer for that either. 2 decks below, Sol was running yet another calibration pass on her medical scanners with Doss and Cray. The 3 of them hunched over a display table covered in projected biological schematics pulled from the Coalition's thin human archive. An incomplete skeletal structure, an approximate metabolic range, notes flagged as unconfirmed in nearly every field. If the numbers in the old records are even close to right, Doss said, tapping the projected image of an approximate human frame, then physically, they're not that different from a lot of species we already know. Bipedal, warm-blooded, similar sensory range. Doesn't look like a monster. No, Sol agreed. But look at the notes on tissue density and bone structure. Whoever recorded these numbers flagged them twice for review, which in a 400-year-old file usually means the original scientist thought they'd made a mistake and checked their instruments before writing it down anyway. These numbers, if accurate, suggest a body built to take an extraordinary amount of physical damage and keep functioning. Built for what? Cray asked. I don't know, Sol said, but I suspect we are about to find out. Meanwhile, in the cramped security bay near the rear of the ship, Draith ran his people through their 15th boarding drill, and then, true to his word, a 16th. Corin Vass finally set down her practice rifle afterward and looked at him evenly. Commander, with respect, the drill isn't the problem. None of us are worried about the drill. I know, Draith said. Run it again anyway. When we're standing in that ship, I want your hands moving before your head has to think about it. Whatever is or isn't waiting for us over there, I am not losing anyone because we hesitated for 2 extra seconds. Vass didn't argue. She picked the rifle back up. By the 7th day, the mood aboard the Ansuvar's Hope had settled into something quieter than excitement and heavier than fear, the particular, focused calm of people who knew they were approaching something that would matter, one way or another, for the rest of their lives. On the 8th day, the Ansuvar's Hope dropped out of its final jump at the edge of the Kelvorn Drift, and for the first time, the whole team saw the ship with their own eyes, rather than through sensor data and old images. It was worse in person, bigger, darker. The scarring along its hull was visible, even at a distance of several thousand kilometers, long black scorch marks running the length of the vessel, like claw marks dragged across metal. The torn section on its flank gaped open, like a wound that had never been given the chance to heal, edges of shattered decking floating loose around it in a slow, silent orbit of debris. And along its length, faint and patient, the lights still blinked. Nobody on the bridge said anything for a long time. Well, Vey said finally, quietly, mostly to himself, there it is. Draith stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes narrowed at the screen. He did not share the awe in Vey's voice. He was thinking, instead, about how many places on a ship that size a person, or anything else, could be hiding, and how few of those places his 6-person team could possibly cover. Take us in, Vey said to the pilot. Slow approach. Full scans as we go. The Ansuvar's Hope began its final approach toward the derelict, and behind them, the dying light of the Kelvorn Drift's dead stars fell away into darkness, leaving only the ship, vast, silent, and somehow still, impossibly, alive. The approach itself took the better part of a day. Up close, the true scale of the wreck became almost impossible for the mind to hold on to. What had looked, from a distance, like scarring along the hull turned out, up close, to be individual gashes wider than the Ansuvar's hope itself. Torn metal edges thick enough to have once been armor plating measured in meters rather than centimeters. Entire sections of the outer hull had buckled inward, as though something enormous had struck it, and kept striking, again and again, without ever quite finishing the job. "Whatever hit this ship," Draith said quietly, watching the wreck slide past the viewport, hit it more than once, and it kept going, even after this kind of damage. Whoever was flying it did not surrender. "Or couldn't," Vey said. They found what looked like a functional docking port on the ship's underside, near the edge of the torn section but not inside it. A smaller hatch, oddly human-scaled compared to the vastness around it, still faintly lit by the same slow, patient lights that ran along the rest of the hull. Sol ran every scan she had on the hatch and the space behind it 3 separate times, and 3 separate times the readings came back the same. No active power beyond the ambient hum they had already detected shipwide. No signs of atmosphere, no signs of movement, no signs of anything at all beyond a door that had, against every reasonable expectation, been keeping itself very quietly alive for 400 years. "Atmospheric readings inside the door are minimal but not zero," Sol reported. "There's a thin, breathable mix behind that hatch. Old, stale, barely holding on, but it's there. Something in that ship has been maintaining life support in at least one section this whole time." Draith exhaled slowly. "That's not a wreck, then. Not really." "No," Vey agreed. "I don't think it ever was." The Ansivar's Hope extended its docking collar, and with a soft mechanical groan that seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the drift, the two ships connected. A green light blinked on above the airlock control panel, an old system, unfamiliar in its markings, but its meaning was not hard to guess. The way was open. Draith checked his weapon one final time, gestured for his team to form up, and looked back at Vey, Sol, and Rule standing behind them in their survey suits, equipment cases in hand, faces lit with a mixture of excitement and something closer to dread. "Once this door opens," Draith said, "we are guests in someone else's house, a house that has been quietly holding its breath for 400 years. I want everyone remembering that, every step we take in there." Vey nodded. Sol nodded. Rule, pale behind his faceplate, managed a small nod of his own. Draith turned back to the airlock and gave the order. The ancient hatch shuddered, resisted for a moment as though unwilling, and then, with a long groan of metal that had not moved in centuries, began to open. None of them yet understood what they were about to walk into. They would learn. Some of them would not live long enough to explain it to anyone else. The corridor beyond the airlock was dark, and it was cold, and it was enormous. Draith went first, his weapon light cutting a narrow beam through air that had not been disturbed by a living body in 400 years. The beam caught dust hanging motionless, caught walls of dull gray metal lined with cabling and pipe runs unlike anything in Coalition design, caught a ceiling so high above them that the light did not reach it at all. Behind him came Vass and the rest of the security team, weapons raised but not aimed at anything in particular, simply ready. Behind them came Vey, Sol, Rule, and the 2 junior researchers, each carrying scanning equipment, each moving with the careful, quiet steps of people walking through a place that felt, without any of them being able to explain exactly why, like it deserved quiet. "Atmosphere reading confirms breathable," Sol said, voice hushed even through the suit comm. "Thin, cold, but breathable. We could remove helmets if needed, though I'd recommend against it until we know more." "Noted," Draith said. "Nobody removes a helmet without my say-so." The corridor stretched ahead of them, straight and impossibly long, doors set into the walls at intervals that Vey guessed from the spacing must lead to crew quarters, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, running the length of the ship. Every single one was closed. Every single one, when Cray tried to check, showed no response at all to standard override commands. "They're not locked," Cray said, frowning at her scanner. "There's no power to them. They're just off, dead." Everything on this ship should be dead, Vass muttered. That's what's bothering me. It isn't. They pressed on. 20 minutes in, they found the first body. It lay slumped against the base of a bulkhead, wrapped in the remains of what had once been a uniform, dark fabric gone brittle and gray with age. Sol knelt beside it carefully, running her scanner over the remains with the same careful respect she would have shown a living patient. Human, she confirmed quietly, or close enough that I have no reason to doubt it. Bipedal frame, matches the approximate skeletal structure from the old records. Cause of death is difficult to say from remains this degraded, but there's significant trauma to the upper body. This wasn't natural. This wasn't old age. Combat? Draith asked. Possibly, or something structural. Debris, decompression, an impact of some kind. I can't be certain yet. They found more bodies as they went, scattered at irregular intervals through the long corridor, some alone, some in small clusters as though they had been standing together when whatever happened, happened. None of them showed obvious signs of weapons fire, at least not any weapon the team recognized. Several showed the same kind of severe blunt trauma as the first, as though something enormous had moved through the corridor and struck anyone unlucky enough to be standing in its path. I don't like this, Draith said, after the sixth body. This doesn't look like a battle. This looks like something got loose in here. Or someone was trying to get somewhere, and didn't care what was in the way, Vass said quietly. Nobody had a good answer to that. They passed side corridors branching off at regular intervals, each one leading, according to Doss's scanner readings, to more of the same. Crew quarters, storage bays, small maintenance shafts running up and down through the ship's structure like veins through a body. Vay paused at several of the open doorways, studying what he could see inside without stepping in, careful not to disturb anything before it could be properly documented. Personal belongings still sat where they had been left. A folded blanket on a narrow bunk, a small stack of what looked like books, an object that Cray guessed might once have been some kind of photograph or portrait, though the material it was printed on had long since faded past recognition. They lived here, Cray said quietly, standing in one of the doorways. Not just crewed it. Lived here. This isn't a warship built only for fighting. There's a whole life built into this place. Most warships are, Vay said, even ours. People forget that, looking at the guns and the armor. A ship this size wasn't crewed by soldiers alone. It was crewed by people who ate together, slept, argued, probably fell in love, all in a space this big, for however many years this ship was in service before the end came. Cray didn't have anything to say to that, and after a moment, they moved on. Halfway through the corridor, Draith called a short halt so the team could send a status update back to the Ansuvar's Hope, and from there, relayed on a significant delay to Director Kor on Ansuvar. Vay kept the report brief and factual. Confirmation of human remains. Confirmation of the Skarn reference in old records now apparently borne out by physical evidence aboard the ship. No signs of hostile activity so far. Team proceeding cautiously toward what their scans suggested was the command section. Understood, came the reply, hours old by the time it reached them, Kor's voice carrying even across the delay and the distortion of deep space relay. Proceed with caution. I want another update once you reach the bridge, and I want your honest assessment of risk levels before you consider going any deeper into that ship. Copy that, Director, Vay said, and then, because it felt important to say, added, for what it's worth, whatever happened here, it wasn't quick, and it wasn't easy. These people fought for a long time before this ship went quiet. There was a pause on the line, long enough that Vay wondered if the message had cut out. Then Kor's voice returned, quieter than before. Understood. Be careful in there, all of you. That's an order, not a suggestion. The comm closed, and the team pressed on into the dark. They reached what Vay identified, from the old fragmentary records Rule had helped reconstruct, as a bridge or command center roughly 2 hours into the search. It was a vast circular chamber, ringed with dead consoles, a massive central display screen split down the middle, where something had struck it hard enough to shatter the housing. More bodies here, more than in the corridor, slumped over consoles or scattered across the floor, uniforms marking some of them as officers by the small insignia still faintly visible on torn sleeves. The size of the bridge alone told them something about how this species had organized itself. Unlike the tight, centralized command decks of most coalition warships, this chamber was built to hold dozens of crew at once, stations arranged in overlapping rings around the central display, as though whoever designed it had assumed that a ship this size could never be run by a handful of officers alone, but needed many hands, many eyes, working together at once. Vey found that detail oddly moving, in a way he did not immediately try to explain to the others. Sol moved carefully among the fallen crew, recording what she could without disturbing the remains more than necessary, occasionally pausing to note something specific, the uniform markings that seemed to indicate rank, a small personal item still clutched in one skeletal hand, a pattern of wear on a console that suggested someone had sat at that station for a very long time before the end came. It was slow, careful, respectful work, and none of them rushed it, despite the atmosphere of the chamber pressing in on all of them, cold and heavy and thick with the particular silence of a place where something terrible had happened and never been allowed to end properly. Rule moved slowly through the chamber, scanning every surface he could reach for text. He found some worn plaques beside doorways, faded labels on equipment lockers, and, more usefully, a handful of intact data terminals that, when DOS managed to route emergency power to them from a portable cell, flickered weakly to life. "I can read some of this," Rule said, staring at the screen, voice tight with something between excitement and disbelief. "Not all of it, but some. This is a ship's log, captain's log, I think. The format matches the structure I reconstructed from the old data crystal fragments." "Can you tell what happened here?" Vey asked. Rule worked in silence for several long minutes, translating slowly, sounding out words under his breath, cross-referencing against the small dictionary he had built over 6 years of painstaking work. "The last entries are fragmented," he said finally, "but I can get the shape of it. This ship, the name translates roughly to something like last line, or final barrier, I'm not entirely certain which, was part of a defense action. A last stand, I think, holding some kind of choke point against an overwhelming force. The captain's final logs talk about buying time, evacuating something, or someone, protecting a position long enough for others to get clear." "Buying time against what?" Draith asked, though from the look on his face, he already suspected the answer. Rule found the word a moment later, cross-referenced it against the fragment from the old data crystal, and felt something cold settle in his chest as the translation resolved. "Skarn," he said quietly. The chamber went very still. "The logs described them only briefly," Rule continued. "There wasn't time, I think, for the captain to write more than short entries, but the tone, even through a translation this rough, I can tell the tone. This was not a battle they expected to win. This was a battle they expected to survive just long enough to matter." "And did they?" Cray asked quietly. "Win, I mean, or survive?" Nobody answered. The shattered display screen, the scattered bodies, the 400 years of silence answered for them. It was DOS who found the sealed section. He had wandered slightly apart from the group while the others worked through the bridge, following a corridor that branched off toward what his scanner suggested was a lower deck, drawn by a reading that didn't match anything else on the ship. A small, isolated pocket of stable power, tucked away behind a set of reinforced blast doors that showed no damage at all, unlike almost everything else they had found. "Commander," he said into the comm, trying to keep his voice steady, "I think you need to see this." The whole team gathered at the blast doors within minutes. Up close, they were clearly different from the rest of the ship's construction, heavier, more reinforced, built to withstand exactly the kind of catastrophic damage that had torn through the decks around them. And unlike everything else, they were still, faintly, powered. "This wasn't damaged by whatever hit the rest of the ship," Vass observed, running a hand along the seam of the door. "This was sealed on purpose, deliberately. Someone shut this section off and kept it protected." "Can we get it open?" Vey asked. DOS worked at the small control panel beside the door for nearly 20 minutes, cross-referencing every access protocol Rule could translate for him, before the panel finally, reluctantly, blinked green. The blast doors shuddered, and then, with a low mechanical groan, began to part. The chamber beyond was small compared to the rest of the ship, dimly lit by the same slow, patient lights they had seen along the hull, the air here noticeably warmer and cleaner than the stale cold of the corridors outside. Along one wall stood a row of what were unmistakably stasis pods, 6 of them, dark and silent, clearly long dead. But at the far end of the room, separate from the others, stood a 7th pod, and unlike the rest, its status display glowed a faint, steady green. Saul crossed the room slowly, scanner raised, and stopped in front of it. For a long moment, she said nothing at all. "Doctor?" Vey prompted gently. "There's someone in there," Saul said, her voice barely above a whisper. Life signs. Faint, slowed almost to nothing, but present. Heartbeat, respiration, brain activity. The chamber fell utterly silent. "After 400 years?" Draith said finally. "The stasis field is still active," Saul said, checking her readings again, hands trembling slightly despite her training. "Whatever technology built this pod, it has been running, uninterrupted, for 4 centuries, keeping one person alive the entire time. I have never seen anything like this. I don't think anyone in the Coalition has ever seen anything like this." Through the pod's frosted viewport, dimly visible in the low light, they could just make out the shape of a face. Human, unmistakably human, features softened by the pale light and the faint mist clinging to the inside of the glass. Whoever it was looked, Saul would later say, almost peaceful, almost asleep, in the ordinary sense of the word, rather than trapped in something that had held them suspended between life and death for longer than most Coalition species considered a single lifetime. "What do we do?" Cray asked quietly. Vey looked at the pod for a long moment before answering. "We do exactly what we came here to do. We study, carefully, respectfully. We do not wake this person up without understanding, as best we can, what waking them might mean, physically and otherwise. Dr. Soul, I want a full, non-invasive scan before anyone touches a single control on that pod." Soul nodded, already unpacking her equipment with careful, steady hands, the earlier tremor gone, replaced by the focus of a professional settling into her work. Draith stationed 2 of his people at the chamber entrance, and kept the rest close, watching the room with the wary attentiveness of someone who had not stopped feeling uneasy since the moment they boarded. "Something about this doesn't sit right with me," he murmured to Vass, low enough that only she could hear. "The ship kept one door sealed and one pod powered for 400 years, Vass murmured back. "Through everything else that clearly went wrong here. That's not an accident, Commander. Something on this ship decided that person mattered more than anything else aboard, and protected them accordingly, this whole time. That's exactly what worries me," Draith said. "I want to know what protected is going to mean, if we do something this ship doesn't like." They spent the next several hours cataloging the chamber in painstaking detail, recording every reading from the active pod, examining the 6 dormant ones nearby, photographing every surface, every panel, every faint marking Rule could translate. Rule himself worked at a second terminal near the pods, one that had survived far better than most of the others they'd found, slowly piecing together fragments of a log that seemed to belong specifically to this sealed section. "This was the ship's medical bay," he said eventually, working through the translation. "Or an emergency section of it. These other pods, the dormant ones, the log entries beside them, what I can make out, are names and short notes. I think these were people the crew tried to save during whatever happened here. It didn't work for most of them." "But it worked for one," Vey said quietly, looking toward the glowing pod at the far end of the room. "It worked for one," Rule agreed. "There's a final entry attached to that pod specifically, longer than the others, though a lot of it is corrupted. I can only make out pieces, something about holding position, buying time, and then a name, I think. A single word, repeated near the end, that I believe is meant as an instruction rather than a description." "What word?" Draith asked. Rule studied the fragment for a long moment before answering. "Protect," he said finally. "I think it means protect." Nobody spoke for a while after that. Eventually, Sol finished her scans and stepped back from the pod, pulling up the results on her handheld display, scrolling through page after page of readings that, to her clear frustration, only partly matched the old, incomplete Coalition records on human biology. "The stasis field is stable," she reported. Deep, but stable. Deeper than any stasis technology I've ever studied. Closer to true suspended animation than the kind of medical stasis we use. Vital signs are slow but consistent. I don't think this person is in any immediate danger from the pod itself. But I also don't fully understand the systems keeping them alive well enough to recommend attempting a wake procedure yet. I'd want at least another full day of study before anyone even considers that. Agreed, Vey said. We proceed carefully. We document everything. We do not touch that pod's core controls until we understand them completely. Draith nodded slowly, though the uneasy set of his shoulders didn't fully relax. He walked a slow circuit of the chamber, checking each dormant pod, checking the door, checking the readings on his own scanner again and again, as though searching for a threat he could not quite name, but could not stop feeling either. It was Vass who finally noticed it, a small, steady change on her handheld display, easy to miss amid the flood of readings they'd been recording for hours. "Commander," she said slowly, "the active pod status just changed." Everyone turned. On the pod's small display panel, the steady green light that had been glowing since they entered the chamber had shifted, faint but unmistakable, to a slow, pulsing amber. Saul was at the pod in an instant, scanner raised, reading the display with a growing frown. "That's not a fault indicator," she said. That looks like a transition state. Dr. Vey, I think the stasis field parameters are changing." "Changing how?" Saul looked up from her scanner, and for the first time since they had boarded the ship, her calm, professional composure slipped, just slightly, into something closer to alarm. "I think," she said carefully, "the ship is beginning a wake sequence. And I don't think we're the ones who started it." Draith was already moving, sweeping the chamber with his weapon light, checking every corner, every shadow, though there was nothing there to see beyond the 6 of them, the 2 dormant pods, and the one now pulsing slowly amber at the far end of the room. "Can we stop it?" he asked. "Pause it, slow it down, anything?" "I don't know," Sol admitted. "This isn't stasis technology, I understand. I don't know what's driving this sequence, or why it started now, after 400 years, at this exact moment. It could be a timer. It could be triggered by something we did without realizing it. A sensor sweep, a power draw, our own presence in this chamber. I genuinely don't know." "How long until it completes?" Vey asked. Saul checked her readings again, running the numbers twice to be sure before she answered. "Based on the rate of change I'm seeing, I'd estimate somewhere between 6 and 10 hours, possibly less." The chamber fell quiet except for the faint, steady hum of the pod's systems, a sound none of them had consciously noticed before, but that now seemed, to all of them, impossibly loud. "Options," Draith said, looking at Vey. "I want to hear them." "We could try to leave," Vey said slowly, thinking it through even as he spoke. "Return to the Ansuvar's Hope. Report back. Request further instructions before we're anywhere nearby, when that pod opens. That's the cautious option." Or we stay," Vey said. "We prepare as best we can, we document everything, and we are here, calm, unarmed in any threatening sense, ready to explain who we are, when whoever is in that pod wakes up alone, on a dead ship, 400 years after the last thing they remember. I don't like the idea of that happening with no one here at all. I don't think that's the kind of waking anyone deserves, human or otherwise." Draith was quiet for a long moment, weighing the 2 options the way a man weighs risk when there is no version of the answer that feels fully safe. "We stay," he said finally, "but we prepare properly this time. Full defensive positioning, but nothing that reads as an attack posture, when, that pod opens. Dr. Sol, I want you monitoring those readings continuously. Dr. Vey, I want Rule working on anything that might help us communicate the moment this happens, because whoever wakes up in that pod is going to open their eyes to 6 strangers in a room full of the dead, and I would very much like the first thing they hear from us to make some kind of sense." Rule nodded, already turning back toward the terminal, pulling up every fragment of translated human language he had, arranging and rearranging simple words and phrases, searching for something that might, in the first critical seconds, sound less like a threat and more like an explanation. Vass sent word back to the Ansuvar's Hope, relaying the situation in short, clipped sentences, requesting that the ship stand ready to assist, and that Director Core be informed immediately of the change in status. And in the corner of the chamber, ignored for the moment by all of them, the amber light on the pod's display continued its slow, steady pulse, counting down toward something none of them could stop and none of them, in the end, chose to run from. Somewhere deep within the vast, silent structure around them, systems that had lain dormant for 4 centuries began, one by one, to wake alongside it. Quiet at first, barely noticeable, a distant hum here, a faint flicker of light there, as though the ship itself, not just the person sleeping within it, was slowly beginning to remember what it had once been built to do. None of the team noticed that part yet. They would, before the night was over. The hours that followed were some of the strangest any of them had ever lived through. At first, the changes were small. A light that had been dark for 400 years flickered on in a corridor far from the sealed chamber, then steadied and stayed lit. A low hum, barely audible, began to run through the deck plating beneath their feet, faint but constant, like the ship taking a long, slow breath after holding it for centuries. DOS, monitoring power distribution from a secondary terminal near the medical bay, watched readings climb steadily across systems that should have had no power left to give. "It's not just the pod," he reported, voice careful. "Other systems are coming online too, slowly. Environmental controls, mostly. Some lighting. It's like the ship is waking up around the person in that pod, not just for them." "Can you tell what's driving it?" Vey asked. "No," Doss admitted. "There's no central control terminal I can find that explains it. It's almost like the ship itself is responding, like it knows." Draith didn't like that answer, and he said so plainly, but there was nothing to be done about it except keep watching, keep recording, and wait. Cray, assigned to help Doss monitor the spreading power readings, found herself growing quietly unsettled by the pattern of it. "It's not random," she said, studying the map of activating systems that had built up on her display over the past few hours. "Look at the order. Life support first, then internal sensors, then structural integrity fields, then communications relays, ship-wide. It's coming back online the way you'd bring a ship back from a planned shutdown, not the way a system reboots after a random power surge. Somebody designed this sequence, a long time ago, to happen in exactly this order." "For what purpose?" Doss asked. "I don't know," Cray admitted, "but it doesn't look like an accident. It looks like a plan." Vey overheard the exchange and found himself turning the thought over for a long while afterward, unable to shake the growing sense that they were not simply witnessing a stasis pod completing its function, but watching an entire vessel, one built by a species capable of holding a line against something the old records still refused to name lightly, quietly preparing itself for something. What that something might be, none of them could say. But the careful, deliberate order of it sat uneasily with all of them, a reminder that whatever had built this ship had built it with purpose in every system, down to the smallest detail, and none of that purpose had ever been explained to the people now standing inside it. Between readings, the team allowed themselves brief moments of rest in shifts, though none of them slept deeply, if at all. Vey spent part of the 4th hour walking a slow circuit of the chamber, studying the 6 dormant pods lining the wall, reading what fragments of names Rule had managed to translate from the corroded plaques beside each one. He found himself, without quite meaning to, speaking each name quietly aloud as he passed, a small private gesture of respect for 6 people who had not survived whatever had happened here, standing in the same room as the one person who apparently had. "You don't have to do that," Sol said gently, noticing him from across the chamber. "I know," Vey said. "I want to anyway." By the 6th hour, the tension in the chamber had settled into something almost bearable. Not calm exactly, but a kind of focused, waiting stillness that came from having exhausted every immediate question and having nothing left to do but watch the numbers climb and prepare, as best they could, for whatever came at the end of them. Rule spent the hours building what he could, short phrases, simple words, arranged into what he hoped would sound calm and non-threatening in whatever remained of spoken human language. He tested pronunciations quietly to himself, adjusting again and again, aware that he had perhaps 6 hours to prepare for a conversation that 4 centuries of accumulated coalition scholarship had never actually managed to have. If I get this wrong, he admitted to Vey at one point, if my reconstruction of the language is flawed in some basic way, the first thing this person hears from us might be nonsense. Or worse, something that means the opposite of what I intend. Do the best you can, Vey said. That's all any of us can offer. Sol, meanwhile, barely left the side of the active pod, monitoring the slow climb of vital signs with the intense focus of a physician watching a patient come out of a long surgery. The heartbeat, once so faint it had barely registered, grew steadily stronger. Brain activity, which had shown only the barest flickers of the deepest sleep, began to shift into patterns that Sol recognized, cautiously, as something closer to ordinary dreaming. Whatever is happening, she said quietly, near the 5th hour, the body is responding the way a body should respond to waking, not the way a body responds to a system failure or a malfunction. I think this is working the way it's supposed to work. I think this pod was always built to do exactly this, eventually, and it's finally doing it. After 400 years, Draith said. Why now? Nobody had an answer for that. It nagged at all of them, in the back of their minds, through every hour that followed. The question of what, precisely, had triggered a sequence that had waited 4 centuries to begin, on the exact day a group of strangers happened to walk into the room. By the 7th hour, the changes had spread further than any of them expected. Vass, checking in periodically with the security team stationed nearer the entry airlock, reported lighting activating in corridors far from the medical bay, corridors the team had not even explored yet. Doss's readings showed power climbing in sections of the ship that should have had no working systems left at all, including, worryingly, a section near the ship's midline that his scans identified, tentatively, as some kind of armory or weapons control area. I don't like that, Draith said flatly, when Doss reported it. I don't like that at all. It might mean nothing, Vey said, though even he sounded less certain than he wanted to be. A ship, reactivating its systems as it comes back online, might simply restore power broadly, without any specific intent behind which sections light up first. Or it might mean the ship is preparing for something, Draith said. I've spent my whole career trusting my gut over convenient explanations, Dr. Vey, and my gut does not like a 400-year-old warship quietly powering up its weapons systems the same day someone wakes up inside it. Vey didn't have a response to that. Draith made a decision. He pulled 2 more of his people in from their positions near the airlock, tightening the perimeter around the medical bay itself, leaving only Vass and 1 other stationed further back, to maintain a line of retreat to the Ansuvar's hope if it came to that. I want everyone ready to move fast if this goes wrong, he told the group. Dr. Sol, how much longer? Sol checked her readings. 2 hours, maybe less. Vital signs are approaching what I'd consider a normal waking baseline. Then we wait, Draith said. But we wait ready. The final hour passed slower than any of the hours before it. Sol stood at the foot of the pod, scanner in hand, calling out readings in a low, steady voice, as the numbers climbed toward whatever threshold her instruments predicted would mark the end of the sequence. Vey stood beside her, quiet, watching the frosted glass of the viewport for any sign of movement. Rule stood a little further back, murmuring his prepared phrases under his breath one final time, adjusting a syllable here, a stress pattern there, as though the difference of a single sound might mean everything. Draith and his people held their positions around the chamber, weapons lowered but not holstered, eyes fixed on the pod. The status light shifted from amber to a fast, urgent white. This is it, Sol said quietly. Whatever's going to happen, it's happening now. The pod's outer casing released with a soft hiss of escaping pressure, a thin cloud of pale mist rolling out across the floor. The front panel, the one they had been staring through for the better part of a day, slid slowly upward and back, folding away into the pod's frame. For a long moment, nothing happened. The figure inside remained still, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. And then, all at once, the eyes opened. They were, for a fraction of a second, unfocused, clouded with the particular disorientation of someone surfacing from the deepest sleep they had ever known. And then, With a speed that made every member of the team flinch back a step, they sharpened and fixed and became entirely, terribly alert. Slowly, Vey said, raising both hands, palms open, the universal gesture of harmlessness he had practiced in his head 100 times over the last several hours. Slowly, we are not a threat. We mean you no harm. Rule stepped forward, carefully, and spoke the phrase he had built so carefully over the past 6 years of study and the last several desperate hours of preparation, forming the unfamiliar syllables of human speech as clearly as he could manage. The words that came out were simple, deliberately so, a greeting, a statement of peaceful intent, a request for calm. Whether they were correct, whether the ancient reconstructed grammar held together the way Rule hoped it would, none of them would ever be fully certain. The figure in the pod did not answer with words. For a long, suspended moment, they simply stared, first at Rule, then past him, at the rest of the strangers gathered in the chamber, and then, slowly, at the 6 dormant pods lining the wall behind them, and the scattered, unmoving shapes of the crew, still lying where they had fallen, out beyond the chamber doors, visible through the open blast doors down the long corridor. Something moved across their expression then, something none of the team had a word for, because it was not quite grief, and not quite shock, and not quite rage, but held pieces of all 3 at once, the way a wound holds every kind of pain in the first instant, before the body decides which one to feel. Please, Vey said again, softly, though he was under no illusion the word itself would be understood. Please, we came to help. We came to understand. For a moment, just a moment, something in the stranger's posture seemed to ease, some fraction of the coiled tension bleeding out of shoulders that had been rigid since the instant their eyes opened. They looked at Rule again, at the careful, deliberate shape of the words he had spoken, as though searching for something familiar buried inside the clumsy 4 centuries-late attempt at their own language. And then, from somewhere deep in the ship, far below them, a sound rolled through the deck plating, low, heavy, mechanical, the unmistakable sound of something vast beginning to move. The stranger's head turned sharply toward the sound, and whatever fragile ease had begun to settle over the chamber vanished in an instant, replaced by something hard and fast and utterly, completely alert. Draith's comm crackled. "Commander," came Vass's voice from the perimeter position near the airlock, tight with barely controlled urgency. "I'm reading movement. Multiple points, deep in the ship, converging toward your position. I don't know what it is. It's not us." Draith's hand tightened on his weapon, though he did not raise it. "Everyone stay calm," he said, low and even, to his own team as much as anyone. "Nobody does anything that looks like a threat. Not yet." The stranger in the pod moved then, fast, faster than anything any of them had scanned or measured or read about in 400 years of fragmentary records prepared them to expect, closing the distance to the pod's edge in a single fluid motion and stepping down onto the deck for the first time in 4 centuries, legs holding steady despite the impossible span of stasis behind them, eyes fixed not on the strangers in the room, but on the corridor beyond, on the sound still rolling closer through the ship's ancient bones. It was the last clear image any external record would ever have of what happened next. Whatever occurred in the minutes that followed, inside that sealed chamber, and in the corridors beyond it, as the waking ship's long-dormant systems finally, fully, came back to life around them all, would have to be pieced together later, slowly and painfully, by people who had not been there to see it happen. The final transmission the Ansuvar's Hope received from the boarding team was fragmentary, garbled by interference, cut off midway through a sentence. It contained no clear account of danger, no scream, no order to retreat, only Vey's voice, calm even at the very end, saying something that the comm officer on duty would replay a dozen times in the hours that followed, trying and failing to make the words resolve into anything more certain than a handful of broken syllables, and then, finally, silence. Back on Ansuvar, Director Kor had not slept properly in 2 days. The updates from the Ansuvar's Hope had grown steadily more infrequent as the mission progressed deeper into the derelict, the natural result of a team focused on careful, painstaking work rather than constant reporting. But Kor found the gaps between messages growing harder to sit through with each passing hour. The last confirmed update, the one describing the discovery of the active stasis pod and shortly after, the unexpected wake sequence, had come in nearly 9 hours ago. Since then, silence. That's not unusual, given the relay delay and the size of that ship. Her aide, a young Threll analyst named Orsa Pell, reminded her gently, not for the first time. Deep interior sections could easily interfere with comm signals. I know, Kor said. I know all the reasonable explanations. I have simply run out of patience for them. She sent a direct query to the Ansuvar's Hope, requesting immediate status confirmation from the boarding team, and settled in to wait for the long round-trip delay to run its course. The answer, when it finally came, was not from the boarding team at all. It was from the Ansuvar's Hope itself, and it was short, and it made the cold feeling in Kor's chest, the one she had been quietly ignoring for hours, sharpen into something impossible to ignore any longer. Director, we have lost contact with the boarding team. Last confirmed communication was approximately 11 hours ago. All attempts to re-establish contact, comm hails, distress beacon queries, remote diagnostic pings to team equipment, have failed. We are requesting immediate instruction. Do we attempt to send a secondary team to re-establish contact, or do we hold position and continue attempting remote communication? Kor read the message twice. Then she stood and walked to the comm station herself and gave the order that would set the next several days of coalition response into motion. Hold position, she said. Do not send anyone else into that ship. Not yet. I am scrambling a full response team from Ansuvar. Additional security, additional medical support, a senior command presence. I want that ship placed under full quarantine protocol, effective immediately. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out, until we understand what has happened. Director, Pell said carefully, if the team is in danger. I am aware of that possibility, Kor said, and her voice, though steady, carried a weight that made the younger analyst fall silent. I am also aware that sending more people in blind, without understanding what silenced the first team, could simply mean losing more people for no reason at all. I am not willing to make that mistake. We will move as fast as we responsibly can, but we will move carefully. She stood alone in the comm center for a long moment after giving the order, staring at the last confirmed image the Ansuvar's Hope had transmitted, the vast, dark shape of the derelict warship, drifting silent among the dead stars of the Kelvorn drift, its faint lights blinking on and off, patient as they had always been. Be careful, she had told them, before they left. That's not a suggestion. She wondered, standing there, whether careful had ever been enough. Aboard the Ansuvar's Hope, Captain Ren Solari, the ship's commanding officer, a steady, unshowy Korathi with 15 years of transport and survey experience, assembled her remaining crew and laid out the situation plainly. We hold position, she told them. Director's orders. We continue attempting contact through every channel we have, and we prepare, in case a rescue or recovery effort becomes necessary, but we do not move without explicit authorization. I know that's a hard thing to sit with. I don't like it either, but those are the orders, and there are good reasons behind them. What do you think happened over there? One of the junior crew asked quietly. Solari considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. I don't know. I've been doing this a long time, and I have never seen a mission go quiet the way this one has. No distress signal, no partial transmission, no debris field, no hull breach on our end of the docking collar, nothing that suggests a sudden catastrophic failure. Just silence. That worries me more than an explosion would. She ordered continuous passive scans of the derelict's hull, watching for any change, a shift in the pattern of lights along its length, any sign of movement, anything at all that might explain what had become of the 12 people who had walked through that airlock and not returned. For hours, there was nothing. The ship remained as it had been, vast and dark and silent, its faint lights blinking their same slow, patient rhythm. And then, close to the 14-hour mark since the team had gone quiet, one of the sensor officers called out, sharp and sudden, breaking the long, tense silence of the bridge. Captain, I have a change. Hull lighting pattern just shifted across nearly a third of the ship's visible surface. Whatever's happening in there, it's spreading. Solari crossed to the display and watched, along with the rest of her bridge crew, as section after section of the enormous derelict began, slowly and deliberately, to light up, not the faint, scattered glow they had grown used to over the past day, but something brighter, steadier, more purposeful, spreading outward from somewhere deep within the ship's core like a light finally being allowed to burn at full strength after 400 years of being kept carefully, deliberately dim. "Send it to the director immediately," Solari said quietly, "and get me a full sensor sweep. I want to know if anything else about that ship is changing, right now, and I want to know before it changes any further." Solari stayed on the bridge through the rest of that long, uneasy watch, refusing every suggestion from her crew that she get some rest. She watched the derelict's lights continue to spread, section by section, across the enormous hull, and she thought, more than once, about Director Kor's final instruction before the Ansuvar's Hope had departed Coalition space, bring them home, and about how very far away home suddenly felt, sitting at the edge of a dead system, watching a 400-year-old warship slowly, deliberately, wake itself up around 12 people who had stopped answering more than half a day ago. She ordered a second full sensor sweep, and a third, cataloging every visible change in obsessive detail, building a record that she hoped, somewhere in the back of her mind, would matter later, either to help whoever came next understand what they were walking into, or, in the event that no explanation ever came from inside that ship at all, to stand as the only account anyone would ever have of what had happened to a team of 12 good people who had gone in, wanting only to understand. The response fleet from Ansuvar, she knew, was still days away, days of watching and waiting and hoping that the silence coming from the derelict meant caution rather than catastrophe. She did not allow herself to fully believe either possibility. She simply watched and recorded and waited, the way Kor had ordered her to, because that was the job, and because there was, for the moment, nothing else that could be done. Deep within the vast, waking structure of the derelict, far beyond what the Ansuvar's Hope sensors could see or explain, something that had slept in careful, patient stillness for 400 years, had finally, fully, opened its eyes. And the 12 people who had come aboard to study it were about to find out exactly what that meant. The Coalition response fleet arrived at the edge of the Kelvorn Drift 6 days after the Ansuvar's Hope first lost contact with the boarding team. It was, by the standards of a scientific mission, an enormous show of force. 3 Coalition cruisers, a full medical frigate, and a specialized recovery vessel, all under the direct command of Director Kor herself, who had insisted, over the objections of General Oven, on making the journey in person. "You are Coalition intelligence, not a field officer," Oven had told her, back on Ansuvar. "Send someone else." "I sent 12 people into that ship on my authority," Kor had answered. "I am not staying home while someone else goes to find out what happened to them." Ovun had not argued further. The 6 days between the loss of contact and the fleet's arrival had been some of the longest of Kor's career. She had spent them in near constant motion, briefing the Coalition Council on the situation, fielding difficult questions from representatives of member species who wanted to know why a scientific mission had been allowed to walk into a 400-year-old warship with only a handful of security personnel, and privately, in the quiet hours when no one else could see her, running through every version of the report she might one day have to deliver to the families of the 12 people she had sent. She had also spent those 6 days learning everything the Coalition's archives could tell her about the Skarn, which turned out to be almost nothing. A handful of second-hand references, a single line, buried in a Coalition historian's private notes from over a century earlier, describing them only as a hunger that does not negotiate, no images, no confirmed physical description, no record of any Coalition species ever having encountered them directly. Whatever the Skarn were, they belonged entirely to human history, and human history, until 6 days ago, had been a closed book to everyone still living. That, more than anything, was what kept Kor awake through the journey to the Kelvorn Drift. Not simply the fear of what had happened to her people, but the growing understanding that the Coalition was walking, almost blind, into the edges of a story far larger and far older than anyone in the council chambers back on Ansuvar had fully appreciated when they granted clearance for this mission. The fleet approached the derelict with every precaution the Coalition's finest tactical minds could devise. Full shields raised, weapons ready but not aimed, a wide defensive perimeter around the Ansuvar's Hope, which had held its position at the docking collar for 6 days, its crew exhausted, tense, and increasingly convinced that whatever answers existed were waiting somewhere inside the vast, now fully lit ship in front of them. Captain Solari met Kor personally as the director transferred aboard the Ansuvar's Hope, her report as thorough and precise as 6 days of careful observation could make it. No further transmissions since the fragmentary one on the first night, Solari said. No visible activity near the docking collar. The ship's internal lighting has remained active throughout, stable. No further significant changes in power distribution since the 3rd day. Whatever happened fast, and then it stopped. Or it's still happening, Kor said quietly, and we simply can't see it from here. She spent an hour reviewing every scrap of data the Ansuvar's Hope had gathered, the original mission logs, the sensor sweeps, the fragmentary final transmission, which she made the comm officer play for her 4 separate times, listening past the static and the broken syllables, trying to hear something none of the previous listeners had caught. She did not find it, but in Vei's calm, steady voice, even cut off mid-sentence, even distorted by interference, she thought she heard something that mattered. Not panic, not the sound of a man in the final moment of disaster, but the sound of someone still trying, right up until the signal died, to explain something calmly to whoever was listening. He wasn't afraid, she said quietly, to no one in particular. Whatever was happening to him, in that last moment, he wasn't afraid of it. The recovery team Kor assembled to go aboard was larger and more heavily prepared than the original mission, a full security company under General Oven's own second-in-command, a Cenovan officer named Colonel Reth Amaya, along with a fresh medical team, additional linguists working from Rule's own preparatory notes left behind on the Ansuvar's Hope, and Kor herself, insisting on joining the boarding party despite every objection Amaya raised. Director, with respect, if something aboard that ship is dangerous enough to silence a trained security detachment, you are the last person who should be walking into it. I am aware of the risk, Colonel, Kor said. I am going anyway. If we find survivors, they deserve to see someone from the coalition prepared to take responsibility for what happened, not simply another security escort. And if we find only the dead, then I intend to be the one who explains to their families, honestly, that I was there when we found the truth, rather than reading it secondhand in someone else's report. Amaya did not argue further, though he made it clear, in the careful, methodical way he organized the boarding formation, that he intended to keep the director as far from any potential danger as his orders would allow. They crossed the docking collar 6 hours after the fleet's arrival, moving through the same long, dark corridor the first team had walked 6 days earlier, except it was no longer dark. Lights ran the length of the passage now, steady and functional, illuminating details the first team had only glimpsed by weapon light, the true scale of the corridor, the countless closed doors lining its length, and, still there, undisturbed, the scattered remains of the crew who had died 400 years earlier, exactly where the first team had found and recorded them. No sign of additional casualties along this route, Amaya reported quietly as they advanced. The remains here match the first team's documentation exactly. Nothing's been disturbed. They passed the same rows of closed crew quarters the first team had documented, though now, under full ship lighting, small details stood out that had been lost before in the dimness, faded markings above certain doors that Doran identified, tentatively, as family names rather than rank designations, suggesting entire households had once lived aboard this vessel together, generations of the same family serving side by side. It was a detail that struck Kor harder than she expected, a quiet reminder that the ship around her had once been not just a weapon, but a home, carrying entire lives within its enormous hull long before it became a tomb. They reached the bridge an hour later, and found it too, largely unchanged. The shattered central display, the fallen crew at their long-dead stations, the terminal Rule had used to translate the ship's final logs, still sitting where the first team had left it, though now, Kor noted, faintly powered, its screen displaying something none of them had left there. Amaya's linguist, a careful young thrall named Vest Doran, studied the screen for a long moment before speaking. It's the same log entry Rule translated, she said slowly, the one about the last stand. But there's more here now. More of the file has become readable, somehow, as though restoring power to this terminal unlocked additional data that wasn't accessible before. Give me a few minutes. Kor waited, along with the rest of the team, while Doran worked through the newly revealed text, cross-referencing it against Rule's preparatory notes. This is a fuller version of the captain's final log, Doran said eventually. It confirms what Rule found before: the last stand, the evacuation, the reference to the Scarn. But there's more detail here about what they were protecting. Not a place, a person. Someone described here as, she paused, working through the translation carefully, as essential to what comes after. The log doesn't explain further than that. But it's clear the crew of this ship gave everything they had, specifically, to make sure this one person survived, whatever else happened to the rest of them. Kor looked toward the corridor leading deeper into the ship, toward the sealed medical chamber the first team's records had described. Then let's go find out if it worked, she said. They found the medical chamber's blast doors standing open, exactly as the first team had left them. Inside, the 6 dormant pods still lined the wall, undisturbed. The 7th pod, the one that had held a living human for 400 years, stood empty, its casing open, exactly as it had been in the last images the first team ever transmitted. But the chamber was not empty of people. 6 of the 12 members of the original team were there, alive, though clearly exhausted, gathered near the back of the chamber in a rough defensive formation that had clearly been holding position for days. Vey was among them, along with Sol, Cray, and 3 of Draith's security detachment, including Vass, who stood at the front of the group, weapon raised, until she recognized the coalition insignia on Amaya's approaching soldiers and lowered it slowly, her shoulders sagging, with something that looked like disbelief as much as relief. "Colonel," she said, voice rough with days of tension and too little sleep. "Colonel, thank every star you found us." Kor pushed forward, past the security line the moment she saw them, ignoring Amaya's protest, crossing the chamber quickly to where Vey stood, pale and thin, but unmistakably alive. "Director," Vey said, and something in his composed, careful expression finally cracked, just slightly, at the sight of her. "You came yourself." "Of course I did," Kor said, taking in the state of him, the hollow look around his eyes, the way his hands would not quite stay still, the careful, deliberate calm of someone holding himself together through sheer discipline rather than any real sense of safety. "You look like you haven't slept since we lost contact." "None of us have much," Vey admitted. "Sleeping felt like the wrong thing to do, after what happened. It still does, if I'm honest." Care looked past him, counting quickly. Sol, Cray, Vass, 2 more of Draith's security detail she recognized but could not immediately name, all of them thinner, more haggard than the confident team she had seen off 11 days earlier, all of them alive, and all of them watching her with the particular exhausted relief of people who had genuinely, privately, stopped believing rescue was coming. "What happened here, Ansel?" she asked again, quieter this time. "Where are the rest of your people?" Vey's expression tightened, and for a moment he didn't answer, glancing instead toward Sol, who stepped forward and answered in his place, her voice steady despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face. "Dawson Rule didn't make it," she said quietly. "Neither did 2 of Commander Draith's people, Farron and Tallow. It happened fast, in the first few minutes after the wake sequence completed. I'll explain everything, Director, but I think you need to see the rest of it for yourself first. Some of this is easier to show than to say." "Where is the human?" Kor asked. "Where is Commander Draith?" Sol hesitated, and it was Vass, stepping forward, who finally answered. "They're both alive," she said. "But Director, you should know, what happened here wasn't an attack, not the way we thought, back on Ansovar, when we lost contact and assumed the worst. It was something else, something none of us fully understood until it was already over." They led Kor and the recovery team deeper into the ship, past sections that showed clear signs of recent damage, scorch marks along the walls that had not been there in the first team's original survey, a section of corridor where the deck plating had been torn and buckled, a large chamber, further along, that had clearly once housed some manner of automated defense system, now sitting dark and silent, its mechanisms visibly disabled. "The ship has automated defenses," Saul explained as they walked. Old ones, built into the structure itself, dormant the whole time we were surveying it, right up until the pod's wake sequence began. We didn't know. There was no way for us to know. Nothing about the ship's design gave any obvious sign of it, not to scans built around coalition military architecture. When the wake sequence started, it wasn't just the stasis pod coming back online. It was the whole ship, including systems built to respond to any perceived threat near the person in that pod. Cray, walking a few steps behind them, added quietly, "We found the control architecture for it afterward, once things had settled. It's old technology, but it's not simple. Whoever built this ship didn't just bolt weapons onto the hull, they built an entire layered defense structure specifically around this section, tied directly into the stasis pod's own systems, so that the moment the person inside woke, the ship would treat their safety as the single highest priority in every system it had left. It's honestly remarkable engineering, even now. I just wish we'd understood it before it activated instead of after." "And it perceived us as a threat," Kor said quietly. "At first," Saul said, "for a few terrible minutes, yes. The moment the wake sequence completed and the ship's defensive systems fully activated, before anyone, including the person who'd been in that pod, had any chance to explain who we were or why we were there, the ship began responding the way it had clearly been built, to respond to unknown parties near its most protected asset. Automated turrets, sealed corridors, structural systems repurposed as barriers. It wasn't malice. I don't think malice is even the right word for it. It was a machine executing a defense protocol it had been holding, patiently, faithfully, for 400 years, waiting for exactly this moment." "And the human?" Kor asked. "What did they do?" Vey answered this time, his voice quiet. "Stopped it," he said. "That's the short version, Director. The long version is going to take a while to explain, and I don't think I fully understand all of it myself, even having watched it happen. But the short version is that the person from that pod stopped the ship's own defenses from killing the rest of us, at what I believe was significant cost to themselves, and has not left the side of the 2 people we lost from Commander Draith's team since it happened. I think grief may be as much a part of what's kept them there as anything else." "Stopped it how?" Kor asked. Vass answered this time, her voice quieter than before, the memory clearly still raw. "There was a moment," she said, maybe 90 seconds after the wake sequence completed, when the corridor outside the medical bay sealed itself, automated turret housings dropped out of the ceiling, and every one of us understood, all at once, that we were about to die in there. Farron and Tallow were closest to the door when it happened. They didn't have a chance. I thought the rest of us were next." She stopped walking for a moment, steadying herself before continuing. "And then the human. Director, I don't know how else to describe what happened next, except to say that they physically fought the ship, tore an access panel open with their bare hands that had been in stasis for 400 years, and did something to the control systems inside that shut the automated defenses down section by section, moving through gunfire and structural collapse like it barely touched them, until the whole thing finally stopped. Dr. Soul can give you the medical details better than I can, but by the time it was over, they were bleeding from wounds that should have put anyone else on this team down for good, and they didn't stop moving until every single one of those systems was offline. They saved us," Vey said simply. "All 6 of us who are standing here right now. I don't have a more complicated way to explain it than that." Kor absorbed that in silence as they walked, the weight of it settling over her slowly, until they reached a final set of doors, smaller, simpler than the others, clearly a personal space rather than a command or defense installation, and Vey stopped in front of them. "They're in here," he said. "Director, before you go in, I want you to understand something, because I don't think anyone back on Ansuvar is going to be able to understand it properly from a report alone. Whatever we came here expecting to find, whatever the word human meant in our old records, none of it prepared me for what's actually behind this door. I don't think there's a report that could." "What do you mean?" Kor asked. Vey considered the question for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice carried something Kor had never heard from him before, in 30 years of knowing him as one of the most composed, unshakable scientists in the Coalition's service. "I mean," he said slowly, That we came here to study a species we assumed was gone. And instead, I think we found the last living piece of the reason every old record we have about them is written the way it is, careful and quiet, and just a little afraid. I don't think that fear was ever really about what humans might do to us, Director. I think it was always about what they were willing to do, and to survive, in order to protect the people who mattered to them. We're about to meet someone who did that for 400 years, alone, without ever once knowing if it would matter to anyone at all. Kor looked at the closed door for a long moment, thinking of Vei's earlier words about the final transmission. He wasn't afraid of it. And of the crew log fragment Doran had translated only hours ago, the phrase that had stayed with her since she first heard it. Essential to what comes after. She squared her shoulders, nodded once to Amaya's security detail to hold their position, and stepped forward to open the door herself. The room beyond the door was small and plain, clearly meant as private quarters rather than any formal space. Two shapes lay on a low platform against the far wall, covered carefully with what looked like salvaged fabric. Doss and Rule, Kor understood immediately, laid to rest with a gentleness that told her everything she needed to know about the person sitting beside them. Commander Draith sat on the floor near the platform, weapon set aside, uniform torn and stained, a bandage wrapped roughly around one arm. Beside him, sitting with their back against the wall, knees drawn up, was the human. They looked, Kor thought, achingly ordinary in some ways, and entirely unlike anything she had ever seen in others. A face marked with old scars that had clearly healed long before the 400 years of stasis began. Dark hair cut short, eyes that lifted toward the opening door, with the same fast, total alertness Vei had described from the very first moment of waking, before easing, slightly, at the sight of Vei and the others filing in behind Kor. Draith got to his feet slowly, wincing. "Director," he said, "glad you made it." "Commander," Kor said, relief plain in her voice for just a moment before she steadied it. "Report." "Short version," Draith said. "Ship's automated defenses activated the moment the wake sequence finished, before any of us had a chance to explain ourselves. We lost Doss and Rule in the first 2 minutes. The rest of us would have followed if—" he glanced toward the human, "if they hadn't done something about it, at a cost I don't think any of us fully understand yet. Once the defenses were down, we spent the better part of a day just trying to establish basic communication. It's been slow, but it's working." Kor looked at the human directly for the first time, and found herself, despite 30 years of disciplined composure, uncertain exactly what to say. The human looked back at her for a long moment, then at Rule's translation tablet, still sitting on the floor nearby where the linguist had left it. Slowly, carefully, they reached for it, and after a moment of searching, selected a short phrase, one of the simple constructions Rule had built during those final desperate hours before the wake sequence completed, and played it back through the tablet's speaker. "We mean you no harm." It was, Kor realized, the exact phrase Vei had first spoken to them, played back now, deliberately, gently, as though to say, "I remember. I understood, even then, more than you knew." "They've been doing that," Saul said quietly, from the doorway, "using Rule's own recordings to communicate back to us, piecing together what they can from the fragments he left in that tablet. I think they're smarter about our situation than we've been about theirs, this whole time." Kor crossed the small room slowly and knelt, carefully, at a respectful distance from where Reyes sat, close enough to be seen clearly, but far enough to make no claim on his space. She said nothing at first, simply looked, the way she imagined he must have been looking at all of them since the moment he woke, trying to read intention from posture and expression alone, without the benefit of shared words. Up close, the scars on his face and hands told their own kind of story, old wounds long since healed, layered one over another in a way that suggested a life measured in seasons of survival, rather than years of comfort. His eyes, when they met hers, held none of the wild alertness Vei had described from the first waking moment. What remained instead was something quieter, heavier, a kind of exhausted, watchful patience that Kor recognized, uncomfortably, from her own reflection during the darkest of the 6 days she had spent waiting for news of her team. She reached slowly for her own translation tablet, found the simplest phrase she could manage from the small vocabulary Doran had already begun building, and played it back, carefully, watching his face, as the unfamiliar syllables of his own language, spoken by a machine rather than a person, filled the small, quiet room. "Thank you." Reyes went very still, and then, for the first time since any of them had met him, something in his expression shifted into what Kor could only describe, afterward, as the beginning of something like relief. Not full trust, not yet, but the first fragile suggestion that trust might, eventually, be possible. He did not answer with words. He simply looked toward the two shapes resting on the platform against the wall, and then back at Kor, and inclined his head, once, slowly, a gesture that needed no translation at all. It took the better part of 2 weeks, back aboard the Coalition fleet, for real communication to take shape. Doran and a team of linguists worked around the clock, building on Rule's foundational research, cross-referencing every new word and gesture against the ship's recovered data, slowly constructing a working bridge between two languages separated by 4 centuries and complete unfamiliarity. The human, whose name, once they finally managed to ask and understand the answer, was Elias Reyes, a name Doran's translation notes rendered carefully into the Coalition's phonetic systems for the first time in recorded history, proved a patient and remarkably capable partner in the process, absorbing new vocabulary at a pace that impressed even the most experienced Coalition linguists. "He's had 400 years of nothing to do but think, once the pod stabilized him enough for partial awareness," Sol theorized, after weeks of studying the recovered stasis logs in detail. "I don't believe he was ever fully unconscious, not in the way we assumed. I think some small part of that pod's design allowed for a kind of extended, deep awareness, even while the body itself remained suspended. I think, in some way none of us can fully imagine, he has been waiting the entire time." In those early days, small moments mattered more than any of the formal research sessions. Reyes learned quickly that Sol's careful, patient manner meant he could trust her scans without flinching, even when the unfamiliar Coalition medical equipment looked, to his eyes, uncomfortably close to weapons. He learned to recognize Kray's habit of narrating her own thought process out loud while she worked, and would sometimes, once enough shared vocabulary existed, offer a single correcting word when her guesses about old human technology went astray, delivered with the faint, dry amusement of someone who had clearly once enjoyed teaching. He was, notably, gentlest with Vass, and the 2 surviving members of Draith's security detail, seeking them out often in those early weeks, sitting with them in a silence that needed no translation, and Doran came to understand, eventually, that this was its own kind of communication, the particular language shared by people who had stood together in the same terrible minutes and walked out the other side of it changed. Draith himself remained close to Reyes throughout the recovery period, an odd, quiet partnership that neither man seemed to feel any need to explain. "He fought like a soldier," Draith said once, to Kor when she asked about it. "Not like someone remembering how to fight, like someone who never stopped being one, 400 years or not. I understand that kind of person better than I understand most people, Director. It's not complicated." When Reyes finally had enough shared vocabulary to tell his own story, slowly, over the course of several long sessions with Doran and Vey both present, the Coalition began, for the first time, to understand the true shape of what had happened to his people. "The Skarn," he explained, as best the translation could carry it, were not a single enemy in the way the Coalition understood conflict, not a rival empire or a hostile species with borders and demands. They were something closer to a slow, spreading catastrophe, a force that consumed inhabited worlds not for territory or resources in any way the Coalition recognized, but simply because that was what they did, moving through space the way a wildfire moves through dry ground, indifferent to anything, except the fact of its own hunger. Humanity had fought them for longer than any single human generation could remember, holding lines, buying time, evacuating what could be evacuated, and losing, slowly and steadily, more than they ever gained. The last line, the true name of the ship, once properly translated, had been humanity's final major defensive position, a choke point that, if held, would slow the Skarn's advance long enough for the last surviving human populations to reach a defensible distance, somewhere far beyond Coalition space, in territory Reyes himself was not certain still existed in any recognizable form. He doesn't know if there's anyone left, Vey told Kor privately, after one of the longer translation sessions, his voice heavy with the weight of it. 400 years, Director. He doesn't know if the evacuation succeeded. He doesn't know if there's a single other human being alive anywhere in the galaxy. He held that ship, alone, watching everyone around him die, specifically so that the possibility might exist. Not the certainty, just the possibility. That somewhere out there, some part of his people survived long enough to matter. And now he's here, Kor said quietly, waking up into a galaxy that has no idea if the thing he spent his whole life fighting is still out there at all. Yes, Vey said, I think that is exactly the situation we're in, all of us. Reyes described, in fragments spread across many sessions, what little he could of the years before the last line's final stand, a childhood spent moving between evacuation sites, a young adulthood spent training for a war that had already been underway for longer than anyone could remember starting, and a slow, steady acceptance, shared by everyone he had ever served with, that survival meant measuring victory in the smallest possible terms. Another world evacuated in time, another line held one more day, another handful of lives moved just far enough ahead of the Skarn's advance to matter. He spoke, once, carefully and only briefly, about the crew he had served beside on the last line, not as a list of losses, but as people. Remembered in small, specific details Doran struggled to translate precisely, but managed to convey well enough that everyone listening understood the weight of them. A gunner who sang while she worked. An engineer who had built, in his spare hours, small mechanical toys for the children still aboard the ship in its final months before the evacuation. A captain who had made the decision, in the end, to keep the last line at the choke point even after every projection suggested the ship itself would not survive it, because the alternative meant abandoning the position too early, and too many people still needed the time that only the ship's continued presence could buy. He says the captain's final order was simple, Doran translated, during the session where Reyes finally described the ship's last hours. Hold as long as the ship holds, then hold longer than that. Nobody in the room had anything to say to that for a long moment. The Coalition Council convened an emergency session 6 weeks after the fleet's return to Ansuvar, with Reyes present, cautiously, carefully, under careful medical supervision but, at his own insistence, present nonetheless, to give his account directly, through Doran's steadily improving translation, to the assembled representatives of every major coalition species. He did not ask for pity. He did not, as far as anyone in the chamber could tell, want it. He answered every question put to him plainly, described the Skarn threat in as much clinical, useful detail as 400 years of aging memory and translation difficulty allowed, and made one request, simple and direct, at the end of his testimony. He is asking, Doran translated, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, that the Coalition treat this threat seriously, even without proof beyond his own word and the wreck of his ship. He says his people learned, at great cost, that waiting for undeniable proof of the Skarn's approach was the single greatest mistake any world they lost ever made. He is asking the Coalition not to make that same mistake. One of the council representatives, an elder Threll delegate named Councillor Osset, raised a hand for the floor and spoke, not unkindly, but with the careful skepticism of someone whose role required it. With respect to Commander Reyes and all he has clearly endured, she said, the Council must weigh a claim of this magnitude carefully. We have a single wrecked ship, a single survivor, and accounts of a threat no living Coalition species has ever encountered directly. I do not say this to doubt his honesty. I say it because the Council's obligation is to every species under its protection, and mobilizing significant resources against a threat we cannot yet verify independently carries its own real risks. Doran translated the concern to Reyes carefully, and waited as he considered his answer. He says, Doran relayed after a moment, that he does not ask the Council to mobilize a fleet tomorrow, or to fight a war on his word alone. He asks only that the Coalition begin watching, seriously, in the direction his people last knew the Skarn to be advancing from, and that it not wait for a colony to go silent before believing the threat was real. He says his own people made exactly that mistake, more than once, in the earliest years of the war, and each time, It cost them a world they might otherwise have saved. Counselor Ossett was quiet for a long moment. "That," she said finally, "is a considerably smaller request than I expected, and a harder one to refuse in good conscience." It was into that quiet that General Oven rose to speak. "Director Corps' original mission clearance was granted to study a species we believed extinct," he said. "I would like to formally move that this council extend a new kind of clearance entirely, not to study Commander Reyes as a specimen of a vanished people, but to work alongside him, as a survivor of a threat this coalition may one day need to face ourselves, and as, I hope, the first of hopefully many humans this coalition will come to know." The motion passed unanimously. In the months that followed, the last line was carefully, respectfully moved into protected coalition space, its remaining crew given proper rest at last, its systems studied not to exploit them but to understand them, with Reyes himself present for nearly every stage of the process, offering context and history that no scan or translation could have provided alone. Corps visited him often during that time, in the quiet research facility the coalition had built to support his recovery and his slow, careful reintegration into a galaxy 4 centuries removed from the one he remembered. She found him, more often than not, standing at the observation windows, looking out at unfamiliar stars, and she never quite worked up the nerve to ask him what he was thinking during those long, silent moments, though she suspected she already knew. "You could have died protecting people who weren't yours to protect," she told him once, through Doran's translation, during one of these visits. "The team that came aboard that ship, you'd never met us. You had no reason to trust us at all, waking up the way you did, into a threat you couldn't have understood in those first few seconds." Reyes considered the question for a long moment before answering, and Doran translated his response carefully, word by careful word. "He says," she relayed, "that his people spent a very long war learning exactly one lesson worth keeping, that the line between not yours to protect and yours to protect is a choice, not a fact. He says he made that choice a long time ago, long before any of you were born, and waking up alone on a dead ship didn't change what he'd already decided." Cora thought about that for a long time afterward, standing beside him at the window, looking out at the same unfamiliar stars. She thought, too, of the report she had finally written and delivered, in person, to the families of Doss and Rule, the 2 members of the original team who had not survived that first terrible waking. It had been the hardest report of her career, and she had made herself deliver every word of it honestly, including the part she suspected many officials in her position would have left out, that the 2 of them had died in the first 90 seconds of a defense the ship's own crew had built to protect exactly the kind of quiet, ordinary courage that had brought Doss and Rule aboard in the first place. Curiosity, care, the simple desire to understand something rather than fear it. She had told their families that Reyes had asked, more than once, in the weeks since, for their names, so that he would not forget them, and that he had said, through Doran's translation, that people who came aboard a stranger's ship, wanting only to understand, deserved to be remembered as more than casualties. It had not made the grief smaller, but she had seen, in both families' faces, that it had mattered. Rule's research notes, the 6 years of painstaking work that had made those first fragile words of communication possible at all, were later formally recognized by the Coalition Council as the foundation of what would become the first true human coalition dictionary, expanded steadily in the months that followed, with Reyes's own patient help. Doran insisted, over Reyes's quiet objection, that the finished work carry Rule's name alongside her own on its formal record. It was, she said, the least any of them could do for a man who had spent the last hours of his life trying to make sure the first words a waking stranger heard would sound like welcome rather than threat. Far beyond coalition space, in the vast dark reaches no scout ship had ever fully charted, something ancient and hungry was, perhaps, still moving through the galaxy the way it always had, indifferent, patient, and utterly unaware that a small, determined alliance of very different species had just been handed a warning 400 years overdue, carried across all that distance and all that silence, by one person who had refused, against every reasonable expectation, to let the line he was holding finally fall. The mission that began as clearance to study a warship, and the single human found aboard it, had become something else entirely, The first quiet step toward an alliance nobody in the coalition, 6 weeks earlier, would have thought to imagine. Whatever came next, and Kor suspected, watching the calm, steady set of Reyes's shoulders as he looked out at the stars, that a great deal was still coming. The coalition would not be facing it blind, the way humanity once had, alone. They would be facing it together. And somewhere in that thought, quiet and hopeful and entirely new, Director Yeshel Kor allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to believe that the price her people had paid to learn it might, in the end, have been worth paying.